Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Before beginning the proceedings, may I request all of you to put your cell phones on silent so there are no disturbances during the meeting. I'll greatly appreciate that. At the outset, I would like to extend a very warm and cordial welcome to the Honorable Minister on behalf of India International Center, on behalf of Organization of Diaspora Initiatives and the Jawaharlal Nehru University, the three who have come together to organize this conference. So let me offer you a bouquet on behalf of all three. Thank you. India International Center, where we are gathered, needs no introduction. But I do want to mention that they have played a pioneering role in a way in introducing this subject of diaspora studies, its implications for our foreign policy, for our economic development, as early as in November 1977, IIC took the initiative to organize an international conference on the diasporic issues. Then Director of IIC, one of our distinguished Foreign Service officers, Shri I.J. Bahadur Singh, edited then the seminar proceedings, which was published as The Other India. A galaxy of speakers spoke at that conference. Then Foreign Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji delivered the inaugural address. So, sir, it's only befitting that you're here today. Some of the leading scholars, Dr. Karan Singh, Srimati Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, Shri T.N. Kaul, Mr. Ambassador A.S. Abraham, who was an authority in India on both the issues of Indians in Myanmar, what is now known as Burma, and the issue in Sri Lanka, and a number of speakers from abroad had come to participate in this 2 days conference in the IIC. The book is available in the IIC library, those who are interested. And then again in the year 2000, with the initiative of Dr. L.M. Singhvi and Dr. Karan Singh, another conference was organized here in March 2000, if I remember correctly. I had just returned to headquarters. The Organization of Diaspora Initiatives, which was an initiative of Professor Dubey to begin with, and I'm privileged to be associated with it. So is Professor Malakar and some others like Professor Brijlal. They are engaged in working to understand the role and state of diaspora communities across the globe, both in domestic and international contexts. It maps the emerging roles, networks of different diasporic communities as a resource in the international civil society space, as well as in the host and home countries. They're doing comparative work also, studying the diaspora policies of various countries, publish an outstanding professional journal, which is very much now a respected journal in the field of diaspora studies. The Jawaharlal Nehru University has no dedicated Center for Diasporic Studies. In fact, Delhi, no university has a dedicated Center for Diasporic Studies. It is a lacuna. I hope with Professor Harshay here, we would be able to fill this gap. And because this is a subject somehow, as I was telling at the book release yesterday of Daniel, that which has not yet attracted the sufficient attention of the IR community, the international relations scholar and the think tanks. It's been largely a field in which very good work has been done by social anthropologists, sociologists, and people from the field of literature. But it has definitely received very inadequate attention from the IR community, and I hope, and this purpose of this seminar, in fact, is to sensitize the think tanks, to policymakers, as well as the international community and academia which are working in the field of international relations, the importance of this subject, its implications for foreign policy, its implications for national security. In fact, my interest in this subject started when I reached Vancouver to take over as India's Consul General on the day of Operation Blue Star. And for 4.5 years of posting, I remained under what is like the Z-class security here. So it made me understand the implication, how because of the diasporic communities, the internal political developments have huge global implications because of the diaspora factor. 87 Fiji coup, the first one, brought into sharp focus the implications of a development so far away. And a very small country, less than 1 million or about 1 million population, and it had impact on India. Then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi took lead in the Common CHOGM meeting in Vancouver to ensure that this becomes one of the most important subjects to be discussed at that CHOGM. And eventually, India lobbied hard for the expulsion of Fiji from Commonwealth. It not only had implications for our relations with Fiji, so much so that our mission was closed, but also a factor in our relationship with two neighbors of Fiji, Australia and New Zealand. Some policy differences with Australia at that time. And then other developments that have taken place, how you see external development impacting the relations, or potential to impact the relation. When the Hindraf event happened in Malaysia, Mr. Karunanidhi issued, then Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, issued a very sharp statement. And it drew even sharper rejoinder from a minister in Malaysia. When 170 or so Indian IT professionals were put under detention for a day or so in Malaysia, 2 days, there were reactions. I started receiving reactions from the Indians all over the world. What should be they doing to ensure their release? So the implications of internal developments and external developments, it's largely because of the diaspora factor. We have all seen its importance in lobbying, in other similar issues, in both in developed world and developing world. Ayodhya incidents had their fallout within the community. The Gujarat riots had their fallout. So every development has its fallout. And therefore, there is no choice. I mean, we have seen, if you see the economic side, what the overseas Chinese have done for transformation of China into a modern industrial state, and the factors that have made it possible. We have organized the largest airlift for evacuation of Indians in the Gulf. So there are huge policy implications. Today, things like radicalization, the communal polarization, recruitment outside India by the agencies inimical to India, all these issues have come up. So I would stop here, sir. Again, once again, I would extend to you a very warm welcome. A very warm welcome also to the foreign delegates and my number of my distinguished colleagues from Foreign Service who have worked on who have vast experience of this field, like Ambassador Rana, Ambassador Sahai, my colleague Dayakar, they have come to participate. Some are presenting papers also. And this interaction, I hope, would lead to greater interest in the IR academic community on this subject. And hopefully, in near future, we would see a Center for Diasporic Studies in one of the universities in Delhi. And I was mentioning to Professor Harshe, hopefully, it would also attract the attention of the South Asia University, because I do believe that if the SAARC countries can come together on the issue of even one single important issue, the treatment of Indian labor in Gulf, that itself will be a very big step in both the welfare of the diasporas of the SAARC countries in Gulf and get them a better quality of life. Welcome you, sir, and may I invite you to deliver your inaugural address. And before that, Professor Dubey, who would make some further introductory remarks to introduce this subject.
Honorable Minister of External Affairs, Mr. Salman Khurshid, Ambassador J.C. Sharma, Professor Malakar, distinguished participants from India and abroad. Ambassador Sharma has outlined all that we had been doing and also given a broad view of what the seminar is all about. All that I need to emphasize that this initiative by Organization for Diaspora Initiative is an inclusive initiative of all diasporas from different countries, and it's an academic exercise where we involve policymakers, journalists, people from business areas, and we try to understand how diaspora fits into international relation. When the Ministry of Overseas Indian was established by Government of India, the overall focus on diaspora studies shifted from a foreign policy to largely development area. And foreign policy and its implication for diaspora and its implication for foreign policies were neglected. So this inclusive academic exercise where we have membership from all over the world, Dr. Daniel Najok, Professor, he's from United States, Professor Brijlal from Australia. There are several people who are part of this, and it includes all major diaspora of the world. And we try to see how Indian diaspora is compared with other diaspora, how their foreign policy is directed toward their diaspora, how diaspora is used, is utilized as a resource for home country and host country, and what role it plays in international relation as an influencer. And it's in this direction, Honorable Minister, that we have published several books, and we have organized several conferences, and we published a journal which is published by Taylor and Francis Rutledge, which is largely focused in this area. I won't take much time. Ambassador J.C. Sharma has outlined the rest of the thing. Once again, I welcome Honorable Minister to this conference and to all the distinguished participants here. Thank you so much.
So may I now invite Honorable Minister to deliver his inaugural address.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me for this extremely important dimension of our perception, both of ourselves as indeed of the globe, and the significant role that diaspora play. And here, of course, in our context, Indian diaspora, but as you're here to look at the phenomena itself, the idea and the reality of the world of diaspora, I'm greatly honored that I have a chance to say a few things to you. Ambassador J.C. Sharma has been a very good friend, as indeed have many other faces here around the table, who've been important contributors to foreign policy thinking and application of foreign policy propositions for the betterment of humankind, but certainly for advancement of the idea of India Professor Ajay Dubey, Professor Malakar, and all the distinguished academics that we have from across the globe. It's really an honor to be to saying a few things in your presence, though I know that you are so hands-on and so deeply involved and engaged in researching this area that I would probably not be able to add a great deal to your thinking. But there are some interesting experiences that have allowed me to at least put some questions to ourselves in terms of the impact, implications, and forward planning on what we can do with diaspora. A fundamental question, of course, about the diaspora is the question about why it happens. Linked, of course, with the very definition of diaspora, and we know the Greek roots of scattering and dispersion. But you can only disperse and scatter something that has an intrinsic quality of likeness, something that is a composite that then gets scattered over. So what is that composite is an essential thing to begin with. And really, in many countries, this would be a problem, but from a different dimension. In the United States, for instance, it's a different problem because there it's a coming together and mixing of many parts that form the United States of America, perhaps to disadvantage of those who really were the local residents of the continent, and that's the so-called Indian people, natives of United States of America, or North America for that matter, or South America. In that sense, the Indian experience would not be very different because, again, going back into millennia, we find there are people from parts of Central Asia coming into India, mixing with India in different stages and in different ways, down to very recent times, up to the times that the Mughals came and got assimilated in India, particularly in this part of India. We're sitting next to Lodi Gardens, the Lodis, the Afghans, the Mughals, and the Turks that came in and got assimilated into India. So in that sense, India also is similar to United States of America, but because of different phases and different timelines, it looks less like the United States of America, but essentially it might be the same. But at the end of the day, what is that composite identity from which there are parts that have scattered to different parts of the world is a very big question. If you look at India, the interesting question, of course, is that the identity itself has evolved. The identity evolved, and for me personally, I think it's very important that a significant moment of that evolution was the First War of Independence, 1857, when there was a convergence of different identities into, for the first time, perhaps, a pan-Indian identity. But that itself led to, in subsequent years, 90 years later, a partition in which that identity was sought to be pulled asunder. And it was I guess, the strength and vitality of that identity that it survived the pulling asunder during 1947 and the partition. But what is the identity then that's left after 1947, and what is the identity that has evolved since then? So when people who today qualify as part of the diaspora of India have left the Indian identity or the Indian reality at different moments in history, is it that they will retain their connectivity with that moment in history, or that they also will have to evolve and they would evolve perhaps at a slower pace or in a different manner than those who've remained in India. It's an interesting construct, and I think Caribbean offers some solution, some answers to this. Going to Mauritius, you get some answers to this. But I think it does leave a lot of open-ended questions as to what exactly is the identity of the diaspora. How much connectivity with the composite home country is important. How close does it have to be? How coordinated in evolution it has to be? How linked it must remain, etc. are very, very interesting questions. So there is, I do believe, a definitional issue. There is another dimension of the definition of diaspora, and we fudge those dividing lines a little bit. Indians who have gone to work, 6 million of them for livelihoods in the Gulf region, are all Indians. They will come back, but they live there for long times. They live there for 20 years, 25 years, etc. But they retain Indian passports, Indian citizenship, strong Indian links. They send their earnings back home largely. Are these diaspora, or they are not diaspora? Or diaspora are those who actually go and transform themselves and become part of the local landscape permanently, become citizens of the countries to which they migrate, and become part of the life of those countries in an integrated and in integral sort of manner. So are there two different kinds of diaspora? This is an important question, and in their reactions and responses, they may actually give away that there are two different kinds. When there was a discussion some years ago during the time that you were all in the ministry, there was a discussion about dual nationality and demand for dual nationality from certain parts of the world for various reasons. For easier travel to India, you don't have to get visas and so on and so forth. But then, of course, we found solutions like the NRI cards and then the OIC cards, etc., OCI cards. These are, but there was an aspiration that we should allow for dual nationality. Many countries do allow for dual nationality, particularly the United States of America allows it. But we saw it in the context of South Africa. And one of the reasons for not endorsing a demand for dual nationality was that it is very important that we allow our people in countries like South Africa to feel in totality South African, rather than have a split personality of, we are Indians or we are South. Now, of course, this doesn't work adverse to the American interest as far as Israel is concerned. And it's interesting how it doesn't work adverse to the American interest. But that's also because dual nationality in the United States of America for citizens of Israel, which is, I think, almost 100% Jews, also it goes in parallel with their dominance of American politics, American media, American financial institutions, and of course, therefore, American policy vis-a-vis Israel. It would be interesting if American policy vis-a-vis Israel was completely different from what it is today. That the dual nationality and the dual affiliations, as it were, and loyalties of the Jewish community, which is a very significant contributor to American prosperity, as to what that would be seen as. But fortunately, that's not a test that they are put to. Again, looking at it from the Indian experience, I think we have to be honest. There is an amazing degree of attitudinal and factual asymmetry. The kind of things we applaud, Kalpana Chawla up in space, we applaud. We applaud the presidentship of prime ministership and presidentship of Mauritius. We applaud our top leaders having top positions in Caribbean. We applaud the MPs in Canada. We applaud the senators and congressmen in the United States establishment. We applaud the ministers in the government in UK, but we never really even countenance a similar presence of people from other parts of the world in India. I think if you count on your fingertips, perhaps somewhere in the field of arts, there may be some space that we have given to people from other civilizations or other countries. But in politics, there's no question. Nobody would ever give it. We barely give space in politics to our own. Where will we give space in politics to people from outside? But I think that if we are going to be serious supporters and serious advocates of the world of diaspora, we have to think about what we can do to accommodate diaspora coming into India, which is not just NRIs coming to fight elections, but people who actually belong to different civilizations coming here. We have difficulty even when they come as missionaries. We have great difficulties. And there are very strong views one way or the other. But we also know a great contribution that they have made in terms of education in our country and continue to make in education in our country. But we prefer them to remain low profile and not to come into public space. And I think this is a very, very big question. Why this asymmetry? Of course, we have a historical problem. We have a historical issue of Pakistan. So that whatever policy we create for anyone in the world, people who we think that we should have greater bonds with, connectivity, outwards or inwards, there is a problem about Pakistan. So diaspora is not only about people who have been part of us and are now somewhat remote, but wanting to remain linked with us. It cannot just be that, because then how do we define our attitude towards Pakistan? Are they not diaspora? Are they not people who are part of India and now are part of another landscape, another world? But if they want connectivity with India, would we create barriers? Because history has forced us to put those barriers. And it may be fine when you look at people living in Pakistan. They opted, or their predecessors opted, to break away from India. So they are not just, we are just going some distance from India. They actually snapped links with India when partition happened, and they made a conscious choice. So one can say that's the exception. But what about those who didn't really necessarily think about snapping links? The Parsis who lived in the pre-partition India, who left pre-partition or post-partition India and went to live in the UK or the USA. There being only less than 100,000 Parsis in our own country, and there are Parsis who want to come back from the UK, if they even want to come back for a weekend or for a week or for a month, just to visit places that they believe to be of their ancestral importance. And we have difficulty if their passport says that their country of origin was Pakistan, or they were born in Pakistan. So we have again innovatively said, don't write Pakistan, don't write Karachi, write undivided India, born in undivided India, so that you can at least segregate yourself from people who made a specific choice to switch off there and to sever their links with India. But this is a very important question, because what we do with Pakistan is perforce applied also to what we do with Bangladesh. And then, of course, there are very untidy political arguments about people from Bangladesh wanting to come to India and to stay in India and to overstay in India and overstay our hospitality, etc. But perhaps this could be put away as a separate, exceptional part of the attitude towards diaspora because of historical circumstances, but nevertheless something that we will have to look at one day. Chinese diaspora is often talked about. The only significant numbers of another community or another country people who are in India are the Chinese. Chinatowns in Calcutta and wherever else. Again, how many Chinese have you seen in public life or in any part of public visual public appearances in our country? They have shops and they make shoes and they do work in leather somewhere, and we know how good they are and they're outstanding, but they're hidden away somewhere. It is so sad that we haven't been able to encourage them, to make them flourish and flower. And when we speak of minority communities in our country, nobody ever mentions the Chinese. Nobody ever mentions Chinese because most people think they don't exist, but they do, and we could have encouraged it. We now are encouraging the Chinese to come and establish townships in India, to come and establish industrial estates in India, but we still haven't applied our minds as a nation, as a society. We haven't applied our minds to those Chinese who perhaps, for those of you who've studied in Darjeeling or studied in Calcutta, would have had as your classmates and as your playmates, but who then disappear from your lives and then they go away somewhere, and we don't see them. We see them again. In more recent times, what happens with diaspora. Of course, there are many examples. You've just been told about the Hindraf agitation in Malaysia, but also the living issue today and the unfortunate tragic continuing saga of our relationship with the Sri Lankan Tamils, for instance. Strange, where we find the Sri Lankan Tamils seeking India's engagement for this important paradigm shift taking place in their lives after 30 years of unending war and misery. They today have a chance to rebuild for themselves meaningful lives, equal participation, hopefully with dignity, in a country that is theirs. And yet it is India and political aspirations in India that don't somehow want that to happen. There are people in India saying don't engage, and there are Tamils in Sri Lanka saying please engage. There are Tamils of the northern provinces, there are Tamils living in Colombo who are saying please engage. It's important because today we have a chance to, within a constitutional frame, not easy, it's an uphill task, but today we have a chance to claim something that we haven't had for 30 years. And that despite the best effort that anyone can put in terms of armed struggle, we actually lost what we once had. And now it's a question of regaining what we had and perhaps building upon what we had to give ourselves an equal participation. And I think that in many other parts of the world we will see this happen, and it'll be a very difficult call when the call is taken, because as I said, how we see things working out for ourselves are not necessarily how they work out for people in those countries. There are very special problems in countries like Canada and parts of Europe, and I think that we have to take a wholesome view of how to find solutions about people wearing scarves in France or the turban in Germany and in France, the kind of attitude that one sees in Canada, the kind of attitude that we see in the United States of America. How do we intervene in those issues? And when we intervene in those issues, do we intervene without being sensitive to the cultural concerns of the local population and being concerned only about our cultural concerns? Or do we find a middle path in between? At the end of the day, I think the big question, frankly, is do we want the Indian diaspora ultimately to become less Indian and more of what they are today. Meaning that should they assimilate entirely and forget, except for historical reference, forget that they are Indians, or do we want to keep them secure as Indians? And I think when I say this for us, this applies in a sense that it applies also in some modification to diasporas from other countries into other countries. There are huge Syrian diasporas in certain parts of the world that influence policies there. There are huge Korean diasporas in different parts of the world. There are huge Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia, in Australia. There are obviously African diaspora in parts of Europe, etc. Should we continue to value, cherish, and therefore encourage and support special identities, or should we really hope that they will get assimilated and merge into the overall transformed identities of the societies that they have embraced? I think this is a big question. It's a question that arises here as well in India. Should we have an aseptic Indian identity, which is enriched, of course, by contributions made by all communities? Or should we allow each community to remain lively identity of its own, but without a sense of disagreement or conflict? And we see that more as a unity in diversity. I think in your universities, sociologists in India have often argued about the unity in diversity model as against the model where there's a mixing of identities and the emergence of a new identity. Now, we do know that the mixing of identities and a development of a new identity was attempted for over half a century in the Soviet Union. But anyone who travels to Central Asia today will see that it didn't work. And that in reaction, Central Asia is now returning very vigorously to its separate identities. But whether those separate identities are really the real separate identities, or are they again fractions of that new identity that the Soviet Union had created, is another interesting question, because a lot of them speak Russian. They don't speak their own language. They assert their identity, but they speak Russian. For a long time, they kept looking at Moscow time for anything that they wanted to do. But they have, in terms of architecture, in terms of institutions, in terms somewhere also of the script, they have tried to move away from that unique identity that the Soviet Union created. The issue of diaspora remains there just as much as it is in other parts of the world. So for me, this offers a fertile area of questions and researches and points of views that can then emerge into theses and into antitheses and then finally a synthesis. But the big question is diaspora about synthesizing, or is diaspora about keeping segregated and separate? Ultimately, is it going to be one single world, or is it going to be a lot of different parts put together to make the world? I think this is a question that you can fruitfully examine if you think it's interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. You have raised some very important issues that have sort of agitated the minds of our policy planners right from the beginning. 55 answer in the Parliament of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru to Seth Govindas of the MP from Jabalpur, and Atal Bihari Vajpayeeji's address here in the 1979 conference. This harmonizing of larger foreign policy objective, national interests, and the expectations, aspirations of diaspora. May I now request Professor Malakar to offer the vote of thanks on behalf of all of us.
Thank you, Chairperson. on behalf of Organization for Diaspora Initiatives, India International Center, and Jawaharlal Nehru University. It's my pleasure to express my gratitude, and also I thank to Honorable Sri Salman Khurshid, Minister of External Affairs, who has kind enough to come here and has given a direction in which we will be having a discussion throughout 2 days. And we express our gratitude and very, very much thanks to our Minister Salman Khurshid. And we also thank to the President of India International Center, Sri Soli Sorabji, who has been very helpful to us in organizing such kind of seminar. Unfortunately, he is not here because his health is not good. So he expressed many times that seminar should be successful. He has sent us the greetings that this should be successful, and I also give thanks to Director of India International Center, Professor Kavita Sharma, who has been always giving us the infrastructural facility to organize such kind of seminars. I also express my thanks to J.C. Sharma, former secretary, who has been the key person in organizing this seminar, and hope that in future also he will be helping us a lot in organizing such kind of seminars. We have here large number of participants from the various countries. We have 18 participants, foreign participants coming from United States, mostly Malaysia, Australia, Tanzania, Nigeria, United Kingdom, and Canada. And also we have the participants from various universities, University of Mumbai, University of Delhi University, Jamia Millia Islamia, and also from SARC University, as Professor Rajan Harsey is always with us. He's from SARC University today. And we have also the representative from IDSA and ICWA. I am very thankful to all these participants and hope that the fruitful discussion will enlighten us a lot in the next sessions. Thank you very much.
Our very good young scholar, Dr. Daniel Newjock, whose book yesterday was launched here in India, a very useful book. He would like to present a copy to the Honorable Minister.
Professor Brijlal. No. Please come this way. Please come. Brijlal का यहाँ पे रख दो. Just keep it here. Just keep it here. Just keep it here.
निकाल लो.
Okay, great. So I'll stay here.
Okay. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Brijlal. I am from the Australian National University, and it is my great pleasure to chair the first session of this conference. I welcome all of you to this gathering. The main purpose of this session is to raise some broader theoretical issues about diaspora in the age of globalization, its implications for the conduct of foreign policy, citizenship, relations between states, and so on. The focus won't be on Indian diaspora, but raising larger issues that could be taken up in the course of discussions later on today and tomorrow. We have three speakers, and it's my pleasure to very, very briefly introduce them, but there's an extensive biography of all the speakers here, so you can entertain yourself, by reading. And of course, we'll have an opportunity later to meet them as well. Our first speaker will be Alan Gamlin, who will speak on explaining the rise of Indian diaspora engagement. He is, for his previous sins, from Victoria University, Wellington, but works also at Oxford University. Our second speaker is Maria Koinova, who is from University of Warwick, I think, and she will speak on diaspora foreign policy issues. And our final speaker is Saeed Khan from Wayne State University in the United States, and he'll talk about the whole question of rights and realignment of rights and so on. So we have a very rich menu of papers. I have asked my colleagues, my speakers, to please observe time limits. Each speaker will have no more than 20 minutes to make their presentation, so that we have enough time for discussion from the floor. So out of respect for your colleagues and for the patience of the audience, do bear that in mind. And finally, we will have the most profound summing up from Daniel, who is our discussant, and then we'll open up for discussions and questions and comments from the audience. So without taking any further ado, could I ask Alan to please speak? 20 minutes.
Great.
Sorry.
It's on? This one up. It seems to be.
No, up. No, it's not up. No, this one. Oh, it's sorry, there's.
Yeah. Doesn't seem to be showing on the...
Oh, somebody.
Sure, we're just waiting for it to come up on the screen here.
No.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Professor Lal, and I must begin with an apology for going slightly over time. I prepared comments to take about half an hour, so I'll try and trim them down a bit, but my apologies in advance if I do go over time. And just before I begin, let me start by saying thank you again to our hosts and greetings to many distinguished colleagues here. I was fascinated to hear the opening address by the Honourable Minister. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to our discussions over the next couple of days. If I can also just begin by acknowledging my co-authors on this particular paper. Michael Cummings is a doctoral student at the University of Minnesota, whom I'm co-supervising with Professor Paul Vala, also at the University of Minnesota, in the business school there, the Carlson School of Business. And Laura Russo is a PhD candidate at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. And they've been, all of them econometricians, so it's been a great pleasure to collaborate with them on this particular analysis that I'm going to present today. Also, I should acknowledge that this research is part of the Oxford Diasporas program, which is funded by the Leverhulme Trust, a large UK research funder. The Oxford Diasporas program is a multidisciplinary research effort based at Oxford University. It spans 5 separate centres at Oxford dedicated to migration research, including the International Migration Institute, to which I'm attached, the Centre on Migration Policy and Society, where I was previously attached, also the Refugee Studies Centre, the Department of Politics and International Relations, and the Department of History, amongst various others. And the program consists of 11 different projects, all of which look at different aspects of the impacts of diasporas. And this project, this wider program, runs from 2011 to 2015. And so my project is a 5-year project, which is just one of these 11. The initial program, I had a role co-writing the initial program specification with the principal investigator, Professor Robin Cohen, and we also worked together with Dr. Nick Van Heer, who's the Deputy Director at Compass. So that's just to acknowledge our funders and the wider context of the program. So this project is called the Diaspora Engagement Policies Project, and what we're trying to do is look at the remarkable shift in state attitudes towards diasporas that's been going on around the world over the last 25 years, and ask why is this happening, and try and develop some empirically grounded theory in this area to develop some enduring generalization about how and why states relate to diasporas in particular ways. And so the wider project that I'm doing, again, 2011 to 2015, involves both quantitative and qualitative research. The quantitative research looks at all states in the international system. Today I'm presenting analysis of a sample of those states, 144 states. But the wider project also involves qualitative research, and this involves interviews with senior policymakers, ministers, senior civil servants who are in charge of diaspora institutions and diaspora policies in different countries around the world. And so we're going around to these senior policymakers around the world and asking them, what are you doing and why are you doing it? So it's a mixed quantitative and qualitative study. Today I'm just presenting the quantitative results. So let me move on to the content. And I just usually like to start by saying that we understand quite well how states manage inward migration across their borders. They typically aim to turn immigrants into citizens by means of a technical process with political oversight, a bureaucratic system to kind of integrate new migrants. And we understand in detail how this is done in different contexts around the world. There's been a lot of comparative research on inward migration policy across many disciplines, and we have a very good understanding of inward migration policy around the world. But we don't have a correspondingly good understanding of how states manage outward migration and relationships with people who leave and the descendants of those people. And I think there are 2 reasons why that's the case. One is that the impacts of migration are most visible in destination countries, where they're politically controversial often, and just simply more visible. So a lot of the research that goes on around migration policy, we assume it's about inward migration. But I think there's also another reason why the policies towards out migrants is understudied, and that's that we tend to see the world as divided up into tidy nation-state containers, and we tend to neglect phenomena that move across those borders. So just to underline the key point is that migration policy in most people's minds, and I think in most policymakers' minds, means immigration policy, inward migration policy. But immigration policies, outward migration policies, increasingly matter, not least because, at least since the 1990s, many states have started interacting with their diasporas in new ways. They've been holding large celebrations in honor of diaspora groups. They've been trying to educate their diasporas so that the diaspora retains the homeland culture and language. They've been granting special membership status and citizenship status and rights to people who live abroad in novel ways, and they've been collecting data on their diasporas. And in these ways, they've been trying to shape the identities of their, in quote marks, migrants' identities, and trying to build diaspora communities that retain loyalty and connection to the homeland. So immigration policies increasingly matter, even though we tend to think of migration policy as inward migration policy. And increasingly, states are coordinating their activities towards their diasporas by establishing and maintaining formal state institutions dedicated to out-migrants and the descendants of out-migrants. And we've looked systematically at the kinds of diaspora institutions that states around the world have been establishing, and they come in different types. At one level, there are quasi-governmental organizations or quasi-non-governmental organizations, sometimes called quangos, state-sanctioned organizations which are part-funded or led by the private sector. An example is one from my own country, New Zealand, the Kiwi Expatriates Association. Another kind, slightly more closer to the center of executive power and government, is some kind of dedicated legislative body for expatriates or the diaspora, some kind of organization that's housed within the legislature of the country of origin, perhaps some kind of standing committee in the parliament or something like this. An example would be the High Council of Malians, which was founded in 1993. Moving to a slightly more important level, we have sub-ministries, formal offices, which are housed within a wider established government ministry. An example would be the Irish Abroad Unit, which was established in 2006 and which, since 2008, has sat within the consular division of the Irish Foreign Ministry. Above that, we have executive level bodies, organizations which are housed within the office of the head of the executive of the government. So an example would be the Presidential Office for Mexicans Abroad, which was briefly established and then disestablished in 2000, the year 2000. Above that, we have hybrid ministries, ministerial portfolios dedicated to the diaspora, but also split between the diaspora and some other ministerial portfolio. So, for example, Algeria's Ministry for National Solidarity, Family, and the National Community Abroad, split portfolio. That was established in 1996. And then finally, at the top level, as many of you will be familiar with from the current context, India, we have full ministries, full single ministerial portfolios dedicated to the diaspora. And so these diaspora institutions are proliferating around the world, but they're still relatively ignored by mainstream political studies. And I think that's partly because they fall into the grey area between domestic politics and international relations, around which the discipline of political science is structured. But one reason why this grey area is becoming more important is because states are becoming increasingly active in this grey area between international affairs and domestic affairs. Now more than half of all members of the United Nations, more than half, all United Nations member states have some kind of formal diaspora institution of the kind that I've just described above. And as you can see on the graph here that I've put on the slide, there's been a rapid increase in the number of institutions since 1980 in the world. So the key point I'm making here is that we need to understand out-migration policies because they're increasingly formal, they're increasingly standardized, they're increasingly widespread, and they're playing an increasingly proactive role in shaping the identities and the behaviors of migrants around the world. And so in this research project, what we're asking is, why is this happening? Why are states establishing and empowering these diaspora institutions that coordinate diaspora policies? And we're interested in two key variables. We're interested in the existence of a formal state diaspora institution, the institution existence, and we're interested in the importance within the government of that diaspora institution. So institution existence and institution importance. And we provide three theoretically grounded explanations of why institutions exist, why they emerge in states, and why they increase in importance in different states. And we call those approaches tapping, embracing, and governing, and I'll explain what those mean in a minute. But just to say, what we're trying to do is to identify whether countries with and without these diaspora institutions differ systematically in terms of the characteristics related to the three theories that I've just outlined. We're looking at systematic differences. Okay, so to look at the theoretical perspectives that we're dealing with, one possible explanation is that states are rationally pursuing material interests by trying to harness the resources of their diasporas. And we call this approach the tapping approach. It basically says that states establish and maintain diaspora institutions in order to tap the material resources of immigrants and their descendants. They're trying to compensate, according to this approach, for brain drain, for weak diplomatic resources. They're trying to secure the remittance flows that they depend on economically. And in this account, states are seen as unitary rational actors. They're pursuing material interests. They're competing for international power. And as most of you will recognize, these kinds of approaches are based in neo-realist and neoliberal international relations theories, rationalist international relations theories. And so in order to evaluate this approach empirically in this research, we're interested in things like whether there's any correlation between a state's tendency to establish and empower diaspora institutions and its demand for assistance during conflict, with its dependence on remittances, with its need for foreign direct investment, and with its worries about brain drain, its effectiveness by highly skilled out-migration. So those are the kinds of things that we do to empirically operationalize this theoretical approach. Our second explanation is that states are driven more by ideas than by interests. They're creating institutions in order to embrace a lost portion of the nation state. And this approach generally goes along the lines that states are establishing these institutions with immigrants and their descendants because they remain part of the nation state, even though they live somewhere else in the world, wherever they are, they're still a member of the nation. And there are two different kind of approaches in this school of thought. One is that the nation is defined in ethnic terms, and other is that it's defined in civic terms. But for both, I think most of you will recognize that these kinds of approaches are based in constructivist IR theory. They say that they're less interested in state interests, and they're more interested in how those interests are shaped by constitutive ideas about what the nation is. And classic studies of this nature include things like studies of Hungary's status laws, which were rejected as ethno-nationalist antagonism by neighbouring countries in the Balkans. The historical efforts of North African states, including Morocco, to monitor and crack down on exiles and dissidents, for example in France. And as I said, there's disagreement about whether or not these kinds of policies are based on an ethnic or a civic conception of the nation. For example, although politics of transborder citizenship in Germany and Korea are often seen as expressions of classic ethnic nationalism, in fact, they've reached out, both those countries have reached out to very ethnically diverse populations, which are defined politically rather than by ethnicity. So this is our second theoretical approach, and what we do to evaluate this is we need to look at the relationship between diaspora institution establishment and diaspora institution importance, and things like the ethnic or civic biases in citizenship legislation, the left or right, particularly right-wing orientation of governments, and the regime type, whether it's democratic or autocratic, the openness of the government to voting by external citizens. And we've developed an original index of openness to external voting. So we also develop a third explanation based on the idea that states engage diasporas less through rational pursuit of interests or identities, and more because they're advised, pressured, and expected to do so by other international actors to share responsibility for globally governing migration. And we call this approach the governing approach. And the idea is that origin states co-create and share and adapt diaspora policies in response to growing international advice and pressure and expectations that they should share responsibility for managing international migration. So this approach, as you'll recognize, is based in diffusionist theories, which see states as members of a world society that shapes and conditions their interests and their identities and their behavior. And there's a great illustration, I think, of this approach in Max Weber. He distinguishes between, where he distinguishes between rational action and socially conditioned action. So he says, you look out the window and you see a sea of umbrellas. How do you explain that everybody is doing the same thing, that they're all putting up their umbrella? He says, well, it's probably raining, and it's everybody is responding rationally to the rain, and they're putting up their umbrellas as a rational response. But often what appears to be rational action, even action that has an explicit rational justification, is actually socially conditioned. There's no rain in this picture, so why is everybody putting up their umbrella? Is it part of a cultural festival? Is it some kind of military parade? They look like uniforms. Is it just a fashion? Have they been advised by the experts that it might rain or it might be too sunny for them? So the point here is that we can't just explain this sea of umbrellas as a rational response to rain, or to sun for that matter. We need another theory to explain why everybody in this picture is doing the same thing. We have to take into account the possibility that instead of acting as rational individuals, these people may be all following the same social script. So in this sense, or from this perspective, our question is, are states primarily establishing and empowering diaspora institutions because it's raining diasporas, or are they in fact more establishing and empowering these institutions because doing so is presented to them as accepted best practice in managing international migration? So we think this is an interesting approach. And to elaborate on that, we think that one factor in the rapid adoption of diaspora institutions around the world is that their states are mimicking peer states that also have diaspora institutions. They're following the advice of international organizations to establish these kinds of institutions. And we know that international organizations are recommending the establishment of such institutions and policies. They're saying to states, it's in your interests to engage your diaspora. It's also in your obligations to your own people, but we think that they're also saying it's part of your international responsibility to take a part in managing international migration, managing cross-border flows of people. They're saying this is how you can help to regulate recruitment to protect migrants. It's how you can help to prevent permanent settlement resulting in brain drain or ethnic tensions. It's how you can take your seat at the table alongside the destination countries and cooperate to manage international migration. And you can do all of this without needing a centralized international bureaucracy, an overweening bureaucracy to tell you how to manage your migration policy. So you should engage the diaspora to play a role in the global governance of migration. And we think this is the message that states are explicitly and implicitly getting from international organizations and other international actors, and we think that it's an interesting approach to try and explain the proliferation and standardization of diaspora institutions in the world today. And it's an approach that's not usually acknowledged in the literature. Okay, how am I doing for time? Okay. 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Okay. I'm certainly not going to finish in 3 minutes, but so one aim of our paper is to advance theory by defining these perspectives, these approaches in the literature, but another aim of our paper is to evaluate them empirically in ways that haven't been tried before. And particularly, we note that the existing literature on diaspora policies and on state diaspora relations more generally is largely case study based, it's largely qualitative. We don't have large scale comparisons of many countries which allow us to develop enduring generalizations, which allow us to develop theories about why it is that states are behaving in this way. I'm mindful, though, that such an approach has limitations. We can observe systematic relationships, we can observe correlation, but we can't really get at causation. And so here I should emphasize that these results, the quantitative results where we look at correlations, systematic relationships, is just one part of the wider project. We're also talking to ministers, to civil servants, to people who are involved in the formation of policy and saying, why are you doing what you're doing? What are you doing and why are you doing it? And that helps us to really get at causality in a way that these results that I'll present now can't do. Okay, so we're focusing on two specific variables, institution emergence and institution importance within the political system, as I said. We have explanatory variables of the kind that I described previously, largely drawn from publicly available sources like the World Data Bank, but some original sources also. We've developed some indices, for example, of openness to external voting, of membership in international organizations related to migration and so on. And we're looking at 144 states over a 20-year period. Sorry, a 30-year period. 20-year period. We actually have data going back to 1970, but in this particular analysis, we're looking at a 20-year period. We're able to control for a number of variables as well as our theoretical variables of interest. We control for variation among regions, also for variation among time periods. So we're able to control quite rigorously and identify the independent effects of our variables of theoretical interest in this analysis. We also control for population density, diaspora size, and diaspora concentration. And just really briefly whizzing through the results that we're finding, I'll go through each of the theoretical perspectives individually. So from the tapping perspective, this is the dominant perspective in the existing literature. It's based on rationalist assumptions. Some of our results match our predictions. Poorer countries seem to be more likely to engage the diaspora. Countries with low foreign direct investment are more likely to establish and empower institutions. Countries that are also trying to tax their expatriates are also establishing diaspora institutions. And so that supports the notion that states are trying to tap and harness the resources of their diasporas. But equally, some results associated with this tapping theory, some very prominent results, are very surprising and contrary to what we expect. So, for example, contrary to our prediction and to the prediction of much existing literature, states with more diplomatic ties are more likely and not less likely to engage with people. We think this is an issue of capacity. If you have more diplomatic ties, you're more able to implement policy abroad towards your diaspora. Even more surprising, though, we find that contrary to our prediction, states with more troubles with brain drain are less and not more likely to establish and empower diaspora institutions. That's directly contrary to one of the main propositions of existing theory around diaspora engagements, that states are trying to do this to counteract brain drain. Similarly, another main theory in the literature is that states are doing this because they're interested in safeguarding the remittance flows that they depend on. But in our analysis, which, as I said, is quite conservative and demanding in terms of the empirical specifications, we find that remittance-dependent states engage less and not more. So, a very surprising finding. From the embracing approach, remember that's based on constructivist assumptions that states, it's ideas rather than interests that we should be interested in. Also a prominent perspective in the literature. Again, we find some very surprising results. As we predicted, openness to external voting goes with engagement, but the relationship is really not as strong as we would have expected. We expect this to be the case because states that allow their expatriates to participate in the political system are probably likely to dedicate institutions to those diasporas, that maybe as a result of the lobbying of the diasporas themselves. But contrary to our predictions and to that of a lot of existing literature, for example, Christian Jopka, a prominent European political scientist, says that reaching out to out-migrants goes hand in hand with bashing in-migrants and is a signature of the political right wing, which is a very, very strong and widely held belief in many in many circles. We found empirically the evidence suggests otherwise. Right-wing governments are equally or even less likely to reach out to their expatriates than centrist and left-wing governments, which we think is a really interesting and surprising finding. Also, the literature says that it's often authoritarian states that try and reach out and grab onto their people while they're living abroad. Authoritarian states overreaching their jurisdiction. We find that more democratic states are more likely to engage, and we think that that's a really surprising finding that suggests that instead of a kind of authoritarianism, that engaging the diaspora might be some kind of stage in the process of democratization where states are opening up after a previous autocratic regime has been in power for a long time. Finally, the governing approach, as I said, based on diffusionist assumptions that states are shaped by international norms. I should say that in the qualitative part of the project, we're finding that this is one of the most intriguing and interesting areas. I'm talking to ministers, and when they talk about the influence that they have, how they've been influenced by other international actors, it's very intriguing. But I should say that quantitatively, this is the least developed approach. We need to do a lot more work here, and our results are still mixed. It doesn't seem that states that are close to each other are copying each other. They're not copying colonial peers either. Membership in international organizations has a small effect on whether or not states reach out to their diasporas in the ways that we're interested in, but it's not a huge effect. And we find that states that are dependent on aid don't seem to be pressured by their donors to establish diaspora institutions, because we find the opposite's actually going on. Aid-dependent states are less rather than more engaged. So perhaps what's happening is states that aren't getting aid are compensating by trying to get remittances. Maybe that's what's going on. So again, these results are pretty mixed, but we think it's a good approach. So just moving to conclusions now. States are increasingly establishing formal institutions dedicated to their diasporas. Tapping factors matter a lot, but not in the ways that we expect. As I pointed out, we found a lot of surprising results that contradict some of the main propositions in existing literature, and that's very intriguing. Embracing is not about right-wing nationalism. It's perhaps more about democratic state building. The governing results are disappointing, I have to say, at this stage, but we think that this alternative approach is a promising avenue, largely because of the results we're getting in the interviews we're doing with senior policymakers, and because we can say with certainty that engaging the diaspora is now an international norm in two senses. More than half of all the UN are doing it, and international organizations are recommending it. So it's a norm in both those senses. And we think this matters because it's becoming increasingly normal for states to project domestic policies beyond borders in ways that were previously unthinkable, taking a proactive role in shaping the identities and the loyalties of people who live in distant territories. And we note that this signals a shift in the basic elements of states, in citizenship, in sovereignty, in territoriality. It's also changing the meaning of the term diaspora itself from an entity that was somehow defined in opposition to the nation state to one that's now defined by the nation states, states creating, generating, engineering transnational ties to their diasporas. So we think these things matter, and contrary to existing theory, they matter in ways that aren't predicted, can't be explained just by domestic interests and values. Some of the key factors that are thought to explain these policies don't explain them in the ways that we expected. So we think that's very interesting, and we think that it may be related to the spread of new international norms. And I'll finish there, and I look forward to comments.
Well, thank you very much. It's slightly over time, but you take the time.
What is it?
Escape. Right, on the right. Right, top right.
Here it is.
Maria, do you want the handheld? You want the
Um,
handheld?
yeah, maybe it's better
Can you pass it on to me, please?
from the beginning.
The lower row, right and left is
This one?
the lower row on the right. Click forward.
This one?
On the right.
Okay, so I don't think I'm going to waste that time. Okay, thank you very much for this invitation at this really prestigious forum. In the first place, I want to extend my gratitude to Professor Dubey for the invitation to come here and for the organization of Diaspora initiatives. And also, I'm really honored by the honor that Daniel Neljux gave me both by invitation to this conference and also ability to comment on his book yesterday. So that was a really pleasant experience, really interesting book, and I wish many of you are willing to buy it. So I am here in my capacity as a director of a research program which is conducted currently at the University of Warwick, but it is sponsored by the European Research Council under the so-called scheme of a European Research Council starting grants, and it's a big grant that helps actually people at the beginning/middle of their career to develop a research program. So what this whole project is about is to understand how diasporas, which are connected to countries or statelets that experience problems with their sovereignty, are actually mobilizing in 5 countries in Europe. These are the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, France, and Sweden. And the statelets and states that we're looking at are actually those who are emerging states, which is like Kosovo, Palestine, Nagorno-Karabakh in the European neighborhood. These are either secessionist states or states that are seeking having some sort of governance in their structures, but they're seeking international statehood. So this is my project, actually. I'm working with the sub-project in it. And there is a postdoc who works on the Kurdish diaspora in Europe. This is a stateless diaspora for those who don't know. And is seeking also statehood in various ways, although it doesn't have a specific place and so on, but it's very well mobilized. And I also have 2 students who work on 2 cases, which is Bosnia and Iraq, which are actually extending themselves towards different countries in Europe based on their internal diversity. And in the Bosnian case, this is on ethno-nationalist principle, and in the Iraqi case, it's mostly on sectarian one. So what we are actually looking and what you're going to hear here is not the story which is about states that expand towards their diasporas, right? And how diasporas mobilize when these states have problems with their sovereignty, with their statehood. So it is a different story, and it's a very comparative story. In that sense, I really wanted to make sure that you are hearing probably different explanations, but also coming from a different point of view as what Alan Ganglen has talked about. So my presentation is more about the foreign policy aspects of this extended statehood, and here I'm really interested in thinking more about how do we go beyond the statist models of foreign policy and foreign policy lobbying. So most of the approaches on foreign policy lobbying have been built around on a very American model, and mostly the literature has been there. Either has been based on specific cases, or it has been based on what we understand because of the American model. And this is not very problematic to understand why. It's because America, the US, has a very strong pluralist system where people can develop lobbies, and it's much more difficult to do that in a system where interest representation, like in European countries, is not so lobby-based. You have to build the lobbies through the trade unions, through the political system, through the parliament, through various ways, while in the States you can have a lobby on K Street and and that is it. I mean, you can mobilize other groups, but the lobby in K Street is a very strong, strong actor. And the literature has been coming mostly from that point of view. In the paper, I talk about a qualitative comparative study and how lots of people have been interested in understanding what are the different logics of foreign policy lobbying when diaspora is engaged. So there have been findings that diaspora are engaged with foreign policies of countries when there's a strategic convergence, so that the state has very much of an interest what diaspora does, so there is a convergence of policy. There is a relative permeability of government institutions, which means that the parliament is relatively open, is not blocked by certain lobbies and so on. Or there is a parliament actually that could be lobbied, it's not like in an authoritarian setting. Diasporas need to be very well unified, and usually here the example comes from the Jewish lobby, Armenian lobby, and so on. That diasporas can use the tactics in the public that are considered legitimate. It's not somebody who goes out there and uses a legitimate means. The diaspora is politically active on foreign policy issues, that enjoys sectoral dominance in a specific field, and is capable of building viable alliances with others. So you could see a lot of this literature is out there and has been specified around different groups. The question is that it is very much of what you see on the upper part of the corner. This is what the diaspora is actually doing, is making a specific link to that state. This is a strong diaspora, it has the dominance, there is a strategic conversion, it's all about the diaspora and the state. What is actually missing in international relations is the understanding about that state, which we see as blue bubble there, is expanding towards the diaspora in order to make strides in that foreign policy establishment. I mean, I took the American flag here because of the comparison, but it is more of a general problem about how do we understand what the states do. And here what we have is mostly literature in which I have somewhat participated, but I think that Alan Gamlen, Ragazzi, Varadarian that I mentioned yesterday, and a couple of other scholars have been very much advancing. And this is the literature about how the state expands towards the diaspora abroad in various ways and in various capacities. And Alan and more recently Francesco Ragazzi and others have been developing different typologies about how the state does this. So just to give you some examples from Alan's work, he was thinking that states cultivate, recognize diasporas, extend rights and obligations, but this is more in the different specific, not specific policy areas, but it's more of a general trend. Others have considered diasporas to be absent, custodian, midwifery, husbandry. We could see like different typologies there. And the most recent article in Political Geography of Francesco Ragazzi has found through a quantitative cluster analysis that there could be some states which are more expatriate, closed, global nation state, among which the Indian state is classified, and managed labor state. So actually the field is seeking that, but the foreign policy dimension is singled out. And in my case, it's really important because a state that does have statehood may not be so willing to engage, may be willing to seek remittances and any other forms, but statehood for them is very important, and statehood is very connected to identity-based issues and is very connected to that foreign policy dimension. So that's why my work is more trying to understand that specific part through a comparative perspective. So that's why when I was planning to present here, I was thinking that there are lots of questions out there in the field which are very comparative, large scale, but comparative, which are very not well understood. So why do some diasporas become important for sending states as assets in their foreign policy while others get neglected? Why is it that some diasporas develop strong support with international organizations like Palestinian diaspora, for example, while others do not? Why do some diasporas organize heavily in a transnational social field, and I'm going to come to the definition of it soon, to pursue foreign policy lobbying, while others do not or prefer to engage through nation-state channels? So these are all questions, all big research paradigms that I would really encourage a lot of people in this audience who might be interested in to really pick on them and further develop. So what I'm not going to give an exclusive answer to these questions here, just map them out. I think that was really important for a keynote speech, but also to present an overarching argument that I've been developing over this year and a half that I've been working on this project, Diasporas and Contested Sovereignty, and it is about the thinking about diaspora positionality and autonomy from the host state versus the sending state. So it is another perspective, which is more like meso-level perspective. I mean, one you heard before of Alan Gamble is like the macro perspective, where here we think about how does the state think about the different diasporas abroad and where they're positioned and how they could be effective, be they in terms of extraction, be they of cultivation, or all of the other resources. So I think for the time's sake, I will not very much engage in many of the definitions. The definition that I used about diaspora is based on Adamson and Demetriou's article in European Journal of International Relations, which is basically considering diaspora as a social collectivity that exists across state borders and has succeeded over time to sustain collective national culture and religious identity and display an ability to address collective interests. So this is really important to think about that. I'm not in a super constructivist definition about what diaspora is, neither I am in a very narrow definition, but it's more about the linkages and it's more about the collective endeavor. There is the foreign policy lobbying, so I designate advocacy activities aimed at influencing the foreign policies of a host state through its institution, parliament, government, party system, various interest groups, and trade unions. And I do make a difference between a pluralist system of interest representation, which is the one in the United States, where activities are clearly pursued by identified lobby groups, and in corporatist models of interest representation, which are more characteristic for Europe, foreign policy lobbying, which can be pursued through tripartite relationships between business, government, and labor organizations, but also these external groups that we don't quite understand. So the whole field about how we understand beyond the foreign policy lobbying, beyond the US context, is really a new theoretical domain. So here, my definition of positionality, I've been working on in an article in the European Journal of International Relations about developing it more for the sake of diaspora politics. And the term has been earlier used in geography, anthropology, and gender studies, but has been little understood and utilized in international relations. Positionality involves power relations where some positions are more influential than others. Positionality is a relative, not an absolute category. In diaspora politics, power is derived not only from material resources, but from the social position an entrepreneur perceives as occupying in a specific geographic location, be it a country, a city, or international organization, specific other location, or in a transnational space which is linking homeland, and other areas. So basically, we see this positionality. Are some people strong more in these specific geographic locations, which are not simply the black box of the nation state, or are they in this transnational field where a lot of interlinkages and connections are happening among people? And some diasporas, like the Kurdish one, is really very transnational, field-based diaspora, and also the Palestinian one, while let's say Iraq is much more nation-based, Kosovo is much more nation-based from my examples. So, and here in the paper I talk about transnational linkages, and I was really pleasantly surprised to hear also that Alan Gamlin is thinking along these lines, that linkages matter. Linkages designate the connectivities between diaspora entrepreneurs in different territories and those others who are in in different other parts of the world. So the linkages, the thickness of linkages or the thinness of the linkages actually allows for ideas to flow, for policies to flow, for relationships to happen. And the transnational social field, I think, is a definition which is built on Bash, Glick, Hirler, and Chanton-Blanc, and others who have worked on the idea that there is a multidimensional encompassing structures, interactions of different forms, depth and breadth that are differentiated by terms of organization, institution, and social movement. And the final part is about autonomy. So here we talk all the time about states that are expanding towards the diasporas, but we don't think about how much these diasporas are really buying into this. Or are these diasporas really strong actors themselves, like the Israeli lobby in the States or Armenian lobby, and they're really pressuring the state itself for what the state is expanding about? Or is there any negotiation between these spaces, which really the term of autonomy could be utilized to think more in that terms. Here I talked about it. So I want to give you a couple of arguments which I have been developing alongside the idea that positionality matters and with regard to the autonomy of the diaspora itself. And here I have the Kosovo case, which is, as some of you may know, was a case of a lot of discrimination and segregation in the 90s from the Serbian regime. Short period of war and international intervention of military kind in 1998, 1999. And ever since then, there has been, in the 2000s, there has been a very strong international intervention, UN intervention, UN governance, and so on, and independence in 2008. But why is this still a case of problem of statehood? Because the Kosovo state, even today, goes out and seeks other people to, other countries to recognize it. They have been recognized by 92 or 93 countries so far, but the others haven't. And there is a lot more going on in this term. Sovereignty, the issue of sovereignty, conflict is solved to a certain degree, but sovereignty is not. So that's what is interesting in my case. So here I see this Kosovo flag, and sometimes it's alternative with Albanian, but I'm not bringing it too, but although you could see it in Kosovo, the two flags go together, is that how they are looking into the different diasporas in these different countries. The one in which they have large numbers are Switzerland, the United States, Britain I took it on the right side, but also Germany. So I'm bringing these specific other countries to see how the groups are mobilizing. So these are countries which host large number of Kosovo Albanian population that settled there. So theories that say numbers matter, numerical preponderance matters, a critical mass matters, that's really fine, but we really need to think about how is this critical mass, how is this embedded in a specific context. And in the Swiss context, for example, the diaspora has been very much forged in one way or another to be relating to the state because of its historical connections of more radical experience with regard to the war and so on, but it is regarded during the warfare period also as the one that really sponsors the conflict. So it was regarded in terms of these are the people who will sponsor us. In terms of the material capability of the diaspora. Why? Because it's close in Europe and because it has specific characteristics. And it is based in a state which actually has been one way or more supportive of the Kosovo independence. On the other side, we see the United States and the diaspora, which is even more numerous. But in the 90s, when there was a seeking of statehood, that diaspora was slated for lobbying purposes. Why? It is in a geopolitically important state. It's in the biggest global power. So it is a power that makes decisions about independence and statehood. Plus, it has a very good way of quickly approaching the system through its political representation. So you have interest representation that is a pluralist one. So, and for years and years, about 9-10 years, that diaspora was slated for decisions. So cultivating transnational linkages in order to go to Washington. There is a point of time where positionality actually changes, because at the time of the war, also the American diaspora becomes really engaged into the fundraising effort. But the question is that it's interesting that afterwards, after the Kosovo conflict, the U.S. diaspora becomes less important in terms of being a lobbying effort, giving the lobbying effort. Rather, is being more important in terms of sponsoring and financial investments. And this is also to problematize also the idea about positionality, because positionality is not an absolute, as I mentioned in the beginning, concept. It is relative. It's relative to what is important at a specific period of time. The positionality is in the states of this diaspora is really important after the independence because these people can be investors, but there is no more an issue to ask the United States for lobbying activities, so that issue gets dropped from the picture. And the UK is the example of a country which is very little engaged compared to the other two. But it also, because of its proximity and relative distance and lobbying experience, is considered more or less a financing rather than a lobbying experience. So let me tell you about the other there. So by now I talked about the strategic center is seeking diaspora for its positionality and embeddedness in specific contexts. Okay, so the other, I will try to go more quickly around this one. Yeah, I also prepared a 30 minutes presentation, but I will try to be quicker. So here, the idea is that this is the UK context, and in this UK context, you see three diasporas that are related to these conflict areas: the Armenian, Albanian, and Palestinian, which are actually mobilizing differently with regard to the state-based and the transnational channels. And what I argue in this paper here is that the Palestinian diaspora, for example, which is very much interconnected and finds its positionality in that transnational social field, is much less likely to engage with channels of the state, of the British state, rather to use, for example, international liberal channels like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, etc. Then to use European Union channels. There is a heavy lobbying on the European Union level in that case. Or one could use Islamic channels. But if you see, they're all plugged into a transnational social space, rather they're so much based into the nation state. And the lobbying activities, the active lobbying activities, are actually existent, but when you compare them in terms of numerical preponderance with others, the transnational social field takes over precedence. Yeah, these were some of the graphs that were showing how the combination between restrictive foreign policy and weak positionality can create more transnational channels. And the final part is about when the diaspora is more autonomous. And here, earlier it was said that not every diaspora is very well engaged. And I mean, I think Alan was saying that some countries are really having institutions, but they are not very important institutions in the state. And Bosnian state is really one of them. And I mean, I can offer one of the explanations from this case, and I think it's because a lot of the Bosnian immigration in the 90s was of Bosnian Muslim refugees. So which means if you want to engage people from abroad, you will have to engage with a specific segment, and this specific segment, to the large degree, might be Muslim. So maybe the state has this institution, but is not very interested in. So in that sense, the diaspora is more autonomous. Is more autonomous than the previous discussion about the Kosovo case, for example. And here in the paper, I talk about the traumatic contentious issue, which in the Dutch political context maintains the diaspora mobilization both on the European level through the state of the Netherlands, but also through people-to-people connections. And this is the problems that Bosniaks have with the Dutch state with regard to the non-support of the Srebrenica enclave massacre at 1995. So I mean, the Dutch had some UN troops there that were questionable about how much they did their job, but this resulted there in 8,000 people being killed and massacred, and one of the biggest traumatic events of Bosnian history. So that hasn't been an issue resolved between the Dutch state and Bosnia and the Bosnian people living there. But the interesting thing for me in that mobilization process is another comparison when you look at the Dutch context, where this is a really traumatic, contentious issue that builds around the group and the state, and compared to Sweden. Sweden has also huge Bosnian migration, huge Muslim migration, but there is no issue of that sort. And then you could see some colleagues, Hall and Rostich have already talked about this, that these traumatic identities have already been shed. So this is the interesting thing. So when we have autonomy of diaspora, the context of the host state or other contexts may matter more than what the diaspora, what the state does from one point or another. And that's the concluding remark. I think that the numerical preponderance and the makeup of diasporas are important, but when foreign policy is specifically analyzed, their positionality in certain contexts needs to be factored in. Diasporas with strong positionality in a transnational social field are less likely to use their energies to lobby through the nation state, but engage through transnational channels. And in the absence of strong diaspora engagement by a standing state, diaspora mobilization is more likely to be autonomous, but also more likely to be influenced by political issues of the host state context. And in that sense, I mean, I think in the Q&A session, we can continue talking about how this could relate to India. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Lal, for chairing this panel, and I want to echo my gratitude to ODI and particularly Dr. Dubé for the kind invitation to be here, to JNU, and of course to the Ministry of External Affairs, and most importantly for me to Daniel for his invitation and insistence on flying out here. And I regret that I'm not going to be here tomorrow for the session, because I have to fly right back out in about 15 hours to Athens for another conference. But we'll make hay while we get the chance. My remarks this morning, now this afternoon, are focusing on perhaps exploring new concepts and new ideas of citizenship, particularly as they pertain to diaspora, and particularly as they pertain to the Indian American, the so-called diaspora. So just a brief background on some of the literature dealing with citizenship, and how in many ways it is inadequate in order to describe the Indian American diaspora. I have people like Will Kimmelke, who talk about multicultural citizenship. But this is not really focused on the transnational, and Kimlicka seems to focus quite heavily on indigenous communities, such as the Quebecois in Canada, something that, of course, doesn't really pertain then to the Indian American experience. Sheila Ben Habib focuses largely on asylum seekers or asylees, and or dual nationals with dual identities based on birth and culture and host country. And again, this doesn't really apply to 1.5 generation, second generation, third generation, and now fourth generation Indian Americans who don't see the United States as being a host country. It is not something that, for the better mercies and hospitality of America, they are there. They are there because they see America, and quite justifiably so, as the home country. We also have Verdevec and his description of transnational citizenship, where one is talking about a single geographic space or between a choice of two different spaces, as well as political membership of the individual to the state. And what I'm going to be proposing is an idea of trying to move beyond looking at mere political membership when it comes to notions of citizenship. And finally, looking at Baalbach and his distinction between vertical and horizontal citizenship. The idea of, in the case of, say, Portugal or Cyprus, somebody who is a citizen not only of a nation, but also of a supranational entity, the European Union. So these new modes of space and how that contestation of citizenship comes about is very important then in exploring ideas of a world in which the tectonic plates of political entities are changing so rapidly. So we have ideas of how then can we move beyond the nation state when having processes of engagement, something that we've heard already today quite eloquently placed by both Alan and Maria respectively, of diaspora engagement. Well, cosmopolitanism seems to be this new buzzword that everyone likes to talk about in the day of in the age of globalization. People like Kwame Appiah, people like even going as far back as Immanuel Kant, proposing a notion of an empathy, a kind of a consciousness, albeit a sophisticated one, of seeing beyond oneself, seeing beyond one's own particularity of ethnicity, culture, religion, and race. This presumes, however, that there's an interaction and a consciousness based on nation states, and in the case of Immanuel Kant, perhaps more so on liberal democracies, something that we can't really take for granted, and of course doesn't allow then for how does one explain a Chinese person living in Shanghai? Can he or she not be a cosmopolitan, despite the fact that Shanghai is, well, perhaps a little bit more liberal, but certainly not part of a liberal democracy in the case of China. What I would therefore propose is a concept called ontological citizenship, something that is much more inherent, something that is more instinctive, and something that is more innate as to how one negotiates oneself within the notion of citizenship. For as I mentioned before, when it comes to Indian Americans who are either 1.5 generation or beyond, they do not consider themselves to be necessarily part of a diaspora, but yet at the same time they have a consciousness of being Indian. Arguably, second and third generation Indian expatriates living in the Gulf have known no life other than living in the Gulf. So they see themselves perhaps as being members of a diaspora community in Dubai or in Sharjah or in Abu Dhabi, yet at the same time their connection to India is insufficient to be defined or described simply as one of a political citizenship. They may have an Indian passport, but their relationship with India may not be much more than that. They see themselves, therefore, as being cultural misfits. Due to globalization, the new generations of Indian Americans may not necessarily accept even the architecture of engagement and citizenship, because the prospect of the nation state itself, something which is a fundamental unit of citizenship, is no longer permanent. Arjun Appadurai, in fact, has proposed that the nation state is facing a, quote, terminal crisis. There's also the idea that there's a presumption that the nation state was to be eternal. Need we remind one another that the nation state, or the modern nation state, is only 365 years old, something that is an offshoot of the Peace of Westphalia, something which was presumed to be modern and was presumed to be Western. But what can we say then about the West's failure at Westphalia? Charles Taylor has in fact called Western modernity something defined by market economies, public spheres, and self-governing people. Well, in that case, what about non-Western countries like Singapore, India, Japan, and Turkey? They will claim membership within that august group. And China, of course, disrupts the very notion of what Taylor has proposed. Hardly a market economy, certainly one that does not contain self-governing people, and a public sphere which is decidedly dubious, and something that would certainly cause Habermas a few shackles. There's also then the reassessment of what citizenship really means. Citizenship is generally regarded to be the mutual exchange of rights and responsibilities. But two things come about in the age of globalization. First of all, that citizenship is not merely a political phenomenon, but something that has economic, cultural, and social, if not moral, values ascribed to it. And second of all, the idea that citizenship does not need to occur within a single geographic or social political space. What globalization is now proposing is that the rights and responsibilities do not need to be exchanged within a single political space. And we find now that diaspora communities, and particularly those of second and third generations, are finding themselves not maintaining a political relationship with two states, yet at the same time feeling emboldened and empowered to seize the rights of citizenship in one space and yet discharge the duties of citizenship in another space. So what we find, and let me provide a very brief history of Indian Americans and their journey through citizenship. We find that they have maintained a presence in the United States dating back to the 19th century, emigrating to the West Coast, not the East Coast, looking at work within the agricultural and the logging industries. And yet, of course, the significant influx of immigration is something that is a product of the enactment of the Civil Rights Act in 1965 and the relaxation of immigration quotas from Asia, from Southeast Asia, as well as from Africa. But we find that as the identity construction of these Indian Americans becomes crystallized, it is one that is largely bereft of any significant contextuality or frame of reference when it comes to religious and cultural practices. And the reconciliation of what is seen as foreign cultural modalities becomes very vexing for many young Indian Americans who are trying to assimilate into the national fabric. Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal famously recounts how he had to renounce his given name Payush for the less awkward and more acceptable Bobby, it having been appropriated from the youngest male character of the highly popular TV series, The Brady Bunch. Such stories are not uncommon among a generation who came of age in the 1970s and the 1980s, for whom fitting in was always a challenge of balancing family pressures to retain certain traditions and customs, ostensibly to ensure marriage within the community, that was of course the end-all be-all for everyone, with the dominant culture outside their homes, in school, and subsequently at work. The rather brilliant Mira Nair, in her 1991 movie Mississippi Masala, then showcases the travails of a young Indian American woman who was caught in the vortex of identity formation in rural Mississippi. For many young Indian Americans, language, cuisine, and customs often militated against feeling as though they could belong to both worlds, American and Indian. While many children feel angst and a sense of embarrassment about their parents' idiosyncrasies, these attitudes would be amplified for American Indian youth seeking social relations with their schoolmates. While their parents may have been enthralled with the Bollywood heroes and heroines of the day, many youngsters express little interest in the movies themselves or in using the cinema as a conduit to learn Hindi. Clearing adolescence and enjoying the acceptance and tolerance of multiculturalism that is a common part of the college experience, many Indian Americans entered their postgraduate years with a greater appreciation for their heritage, now that they had survived suspicions, self-perceived or not, of being fresh off the boat. At the same time, new Indian Americans came into the fold through the burgeoning IT industry in the 1990s, and beyond ensured a connection to India as well as the ability to see their country of ancestry in a new light. No longer was it a nation of poverty in the third world. India was now a producer of brain power and was a supplier of tech capital, both human and scientific. Interest in all things Indian began to flourish, a newfound desire to learn the languages of the subcontinent, appreciation of cuisine, and even the promotion of Indian culture, be it Bhangra dances on college campuses or feature-length movies. Having Indian heritage had evolved beyond being seen as a liability, it was now a source of pride and promise. As India entered the 21st century as an emerging regional and global economic power, many Indian Americans of the second and subsequent generations rediscovered an India with an updated operating system, one with which they could relate more readily. While identifying themselves politically as U.S. citizens, these new generation Indian Americans began to see India through a range of different facets. For some, India offered new, unbridled, and unexplored economic opportunities with investment in various fields and beyond. Yet for many others, there was a recognition that India had several challenges that it attempted its leap into a more prominent international position. Having an ethno-cultural, religious, or genealogical connection to India, many became interested for a mode of engagement with the country on their own terms, free of the imposition of connectivity they may have felt from family in earlier times. The actual manner of engagement has developed in activity both in India and in the United States, depending on the particular focus and priority of the individuals in question. For Indian Americans engaged in projects in India, social entrepreneurship is a key vehicle of interaction. Education and children are two critical areas of focus. A lot of financial and logistical support is given to organizations like Literacy India, designed to provide education, empowerment, and employment to children by teaching them how to read and write. Volunteers, IFRE Volunteers is another project whereby Indian Americans can volunteer in a host of socially critical areas such as orphanages, HIV/AIDS counseling, helping street children, and also rape prevention. And other NGOs, such as the American Association of Physicians of Indian Origin, API, have a long history of private-to-private sector engagement. What we find then growing in the area of the Indian American diaspora is a push towards social entrepreneurship at an equal and harmonizing rate as financial entrepreneurship. But the motivation for these kinds of engagements is perhaps more interesting. These Indian Americans are not necessarily seeking to have a political relationship or a political connectivity with India. Many of them are eschewing the invitations to get OCI cards or NRI status. They see their imperative to engage with India not even one out of a sense of moral guilt that is imposed either by parents or by community, but in essence banking on a modicum of cultural literacy that they feel as though they have with the country of their ancestry. This perhaps is for policymakers, be it in the areas of national security or foreign policy, perhaps the most promising area of buy-in and connectivity with this very important diaspora community, one that is not going to be simply based on existing architecture of political relationships between nation states as these things through globalization are changing so rapidly, but getting down to a core principle of an ontological relationship that these diaspora members have with India. For them, the issue of cultural literacy with India is not a matter of how much it has. That would be an ontic question. What is the level of consciousness of being Indian? The more important question to ask, of course, is the ontological, that they have some level of connectivity with the country of their ancestry. This then provides a new kind of architecture by which people can then engage with the Indian American diaspora and diasporas in other areas by seeking to find some level of post-political or post-nation-state relationship as globalization is now shifting the tectonic plates of these political relationships into something that is more amorphous and perhaps more promising. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we
I have a PowerPoint, just one slide for you.
thank you very much. We've had three very fine papers covering a range of issues. Ellen asked us, why certain states establish and empower diaspora engagement and the various patterns, instrumental and emotional, aesthetic, and so on. Maria talked about, among other things, why some diasporas organize and lobby and intervene and others do not, and the conditions, the political and economic conditions in which that happens. And finally, Saeed talked about what does citizenship mean really in this age of globalization. So a whole range of issues, plus issues that Jagdish raised in his presentation and the minister as well. So a range of things which we can take up in the course of the next 15 minutes. But the floor is yours very briefly, and then we'll open up for discussion.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Lal. And first, I have to say, I'm the only discussant here who has very little time. I hope the other discussants during the conference will have more time. That's a plan. That's how we actually conceptualized it. I had the privilege and the pleasure of reading the papers. All three papers are excellent papers, and whoever has a chance reading them, I would highly recommend that. I have a few comments. I will start with Maria's, then go to Said's, and then end to Ellen's paper. But first, maybe one remark about all papers. I think they bring the comparative perspective. A lot of us work on single states, on case studies, on the intricate details. And I think it's important sometimes to have a larger canvas and to look at these multi-sided, these complex analysis and see what we can learn from them, but also what sometimes these perspectives can learn from a more micro approach. And that's what my comments will be focusing on. Oh, now here. So Maria, as Professor Lal also said, she looks at several diasporas in several countries of origin, so it's multi-sided. Very brief comment. You have a definition of diaspora and diaspora entrepreneur, but the different roles are not very clear in the paper. So I'm like what the roles are, and I would be interested in that. it's also not very clear to me actually what the transnational channel with the state channel means. I mean, I have associations, and maybe I didn't read it carefully enough, but it's not clear enough for me what these channels mean. And the same with the sovereignty goal that you mentioned at several points. Most importantly, this is a representation that I did and based on the questions I have on your paper. You look at the real positionality, the positionality, what people have, how you would judge their real influence. But then there is the home state's perception of those positionality, and that is what prompts them to reach out or not to. And then there is diaspora self-perception. If you interview people, they have a self-perception, and that may or may not be congruent with their real positionality. And then you have to look at the relationship between home state and the diaspora. You have to look at the host state and diaspora, and for both, you have to look at what the real dynamics are, the framing conditions. From your paper, I didn't really get what these are, and I would be really interested to know how the next quote here, you say the positionality of diasporas is utilized differently. But what does it mean? What exactly are the channels? What are the conditions? How do states do that? And the same, how do diasporas and positionality play in with the host state? And you mentioned, the ethnic advocacy literature. That's only in the US available. I'm not aware of any literature on ethnic lobbying in other countries, but I think you have to expand on that and mobilize on what account. You treat the diaspora more or less as a homogeneous block, the diaspora. But I'm sure, especially in contentious diasporas, you have different groups. So are they all acting differently? What are the actors? And the last thing, what actually shapes positionality? And how do source country and country of origin shape this positionality? Alan. Alan spells out this large model. He looks at all the IR theories, how they relate to diaspora, and that's definitely an advancement of all what we did before. But with such a, and yesterday in my presentation I said I love complexity and I love embracing it, but there come a couple of limitations to it that I find. For example, tapping perspective. You say that higher FDI would, you think it would lead to fewer diaspora policies. I say, why? I think that there are few countries that are content with FDI levels. There are few people who say, oh, we got FDI, that's enough. Everybody wants more. So, and countries that are already in the process of extending things to investors, they're more prone, they're more savvy to reaching out to diaspora. So I would be surprised if that would be different. Remittance dependency, you calculate as the percentage of GDP. But the percentage of GDP is not very important. Important is the discourse. How important is diaspora in the discourse of a country? And that is not necessarily important, like the real percentage. Maybe that's also a threshold if you talk about dependency. Maybe dependency only from a certain point on. And lastly, if I understand you correctly, the skill dimension is only percentage of secondary education. So that, as we all know, is not really a good indicator, because often it is enough that there's sufficient critical mass of tertiary educated people in 1 or 2 key countries. That's enough for a country to reach out to skilled migrants, even though there are only 2, 3, 5% of their global diaspora population. The embracing perspective is interesting, and you may include like countries that have an expansionist cultural policy, and also to include the political profile of diasporic actors. Are they against the government? What are their profile? Are they left? Are they right wing? So that might actually influence it. And the last is your governing perspective. First, I don't think governing is a very good word because, but we can talk about that later. I would be surprised if global migration governance were generally a goal in itself. I see it more as a diffusion mechanism. And I myself, I work for the United Nations Development Program. I'm involved in those processes. We recommend those policies to states. I know how this works and how important that is. But if you look, for example, at your quantitative measure of the how many memberships a state has in a country, that is, I would say, completely irrelevant. It's important 2, 3 processes are relevant, not the quantitative extent of membership. And lastly, so I'll leave to a little bit of time. I'll give you a lot of comments on your paper and in writing, so I don't take more time. Just a very brief comment on Said's paper. It's interesting because Said brings in the normative perspective. He brings in conceptualize how actually citizens and foreign policy and the identities of these citizens interlink. And the rights and duties in the foreign policy is always a very, very critical thing. If you talk about extending diaspora rights, policies towards the diaspora, we think about rights and duties. And you see it in the Indian policy discourse that there was always, oh, we give them rights, but what kind of duties do they have? And you also mentioned in the paper that under the guise of national security, states increasingly have a tendency to limit rights, in not only political rights, but any right to act as kind of a citizen. I think that is a very big contribution you make, and we all should rethink of our categories. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure, yeah, thank you for the acute comment. I'm not sure we will have enough time. I'm sure we won't have enough time for you to respond to a range of issues you have raised. These are questions that will take a lot of time, you know, so may I suggest that we take them on notice and open this up to the audience to see if there are questions that you want to raise. We only have about 5 minutes, really. I just wanted to get as many questions in as possible for you to, yes, sir. Keep your questions brief, please.
Yeah, very brief. You see, I think when we are talking of the foreign policy and diaspora, I think it is being talked from a very narrow perspective, that is regime change only. Then is diaspora being used as a tool in promoting foreign interest of the host state? And second, thirdly, how do you do that when there's a conflict? Like in the Armenian diaspora. There may two. Hello. Can you hear me? I think my point is that when we talk about foreign policy, we're talking from a very narrow concept, you see, that is of regime change only. Diaspora, is it being used as a tool by the host states? What happens if there is no homogeneous diaspora group? Nowhere, like Armenians, they are different groups. How do you reconcile?
Yeah.
You see, I would endorse what Daniel said about Mr. Gamelan's paper. You see, the Chinese are engaging their diaspora, and the heaviest investor of FDI is also the diaspora. So that doesn't hold water. And also on the remittance. Now, there, the nature of polity of the country matters. Now, take the case of India's overall percentage, it is not that big a thing, though it's a very large amount, 70 or $71 billion. But take the state of Kerala. As the more federal polity is coming, 22% of the GDP is contributed by the remittances. So there will be hell to play for any government if, you know, the state government there is going to have very different ideas on the remittance issue.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. Yes. Sorry.
Mr. Syed, to reflect on, how do you look at the response of the American Indians towards when we had started the movement by Anna Hazare and now recently another Indian Aam Aadmi Party, and they are contributing, they are engaging. So how do I will appreciate if you could reflect on that.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Talking to you? Thank you. Thank you, Saeed, for a very interesting presentation on the Indian Americans. Now, the Indian Americans continue to retain their regional identity as cultural as cultural entities across the United States. Yet once it comes to, say, fighting for elections, every single Indian candidate goes all across the country, tapping Indian American communities. The same thing is true of raising, say, Thai funds, for technical entrepreneurs. So, do you distinguish between their Indian Americanness and their Indian American regional cultural identity?
Ajay is looking at me, and I'm going to incur his wrath, but allow, say, about another 5 to 6 minutes of response from the panelists, but with the request to please be brief and take your fight to the lunch table.
Well, thanks very much, Professor Lal, again, and to everybody who commented on my paper, and particularly Daniel, who who had the chance to read it in depth, and I really appreciate you taking that chance and making these very helpful comments. So thanks very much. So on the hypotheses, are they valid and useful hypotheses? I think some of them are more contentious than others. Some of them can be haggled over. Perhaps we've imposed those hypotheses on existing literature or developed them empirically. Others, there's widespread consensus that this is what's expected of states' behaviour. So, for example, with the FDI hypothesis, we could haggle over whether or not that is a universal agreement. We think that's a reasonable logic. To say that it's a compensatory strategy, that states who want more FDI are more likely to reach out to their diaspora. Perhaps that's contentious. The other question, though, is the result valid? And here we can say with more confidence that we find generally that states with lower FDI tend to engage more. Now, there are, obviously, to all of these findings, exceptions. We're talking about a cloud of data points and a line that goes through it. Which indicates a general trend. That's specifically what we're trying to do here, is make generalizations. But we completely acknowledge there are exceptions to each one of these generalizations. What we think the contribution of this paper is to move beyond saying, okay, well, we're just going to look in isolation at individual case studies. We need to make some general comments. I don't want to take time to comment on the specific hypotheses that Daniel commented on, but just to say very briefly that those are really useful points of feedback. We think some of the hypotheses are open to debate, some aren't. There are obviously expectations. The remittance one is one of those, I would add. And as far as the findings go, we're pretty confident that empirically about what we've found.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for really good close reading. I would appreciate all of your slides on that one. I think that that paper was meant to be a presentation of the idea about thinking about positionality rather than so much delving in all the details that you see, and they are really very helpful to actually take the thinking further. For me, the more important thing is to think about how positionality, sovereignty, and autonomy really matter in a triangular relationship with each other. And here comes the issue about homogeneity and the entrepreneurship and so on. So I don't think that in the context of a specific group seeking statehood, there is an underlying idea that there is a sovereignty. Maybe this is debatable how the sovereignty needs to be achieved, what it is about, and there where the different groups are. But the underlying idea that actually is the lowest possible denominator is for everyone. That's why, in a certain sense, this may reach to you as homogeneous groups. But that's why I also say that there are diaspora entrepreneurs, and each of them may have their own different one. But there is this baseline, and this is much clearer in cases where they are seeking statehood rather than in cases where statehood is already there. So I think that's a really important difference. And here on your comment about how do you reconcile different diaspora and state relationships, that's a very difficult issue. In the Armenian case, that was reconciled in the favor of the diaspora, I think. The diaspora was very much the stronger material and lobbying actor in international politics and managed to infuse in the state of Armenia genocide recognition dimension, which was not present before, and it was very much resisted. In a certain way, there is always a clash between the two, but about certain issues which the reconciliation could happened, maybe for the good or for the bad of the state or the diaspora. But this is how this issue was reconciled. So whether we can think about diaspora autonomy as a good thing or a bad thing is just to be problematized. But for me, the most important thing is to think in this turn of diasporas that they are being approached by states so that we don't think of them as the mere entities that become incorporated without any feedback and without considering their own autonomous ideas and their own positionalities, which may be factored. Thanks.
Thank you for both of your questions, and they both seem to be dealing with political engagement. For your question first, what we're dealing with here is engagement in the Indian political arena. And there's a generational difference here. The supporters of these kinds of political parties and of this kind of political engagement aren't generally people from the newer generations. You find for them, they'd be much more apt to name for you the Indian American Miss America than be familiar with names like Rahul Gandhi or Narendra Modi. For them, these things are totally off the radar. And as far as your question regarding the issue of Indian American candidates. Cynically speaking, these candidates are quite wily, and they go around to areas of critical mass of Indian Americans, knowing that they have deep pockets, and being able to capture and certainly capitalize on that kind of empathy and that sense of brotherhood, and they do so well. But to be fair, they're not the only community that does this. I mean, imagine, if you will, that you're living in some very sparsely populated, when it comes to Indian Americans, area or state. It's inevitable that one is going to have to go out of state to find those deep pockets. But we find that this is happening in other communities as well. Mormons, evangelical Christians, Tea Party candidates who have a particular ideological bandwidth. The Koch brothers will fund candidates in any state, even in blue states, in order to provide some kind of an opposition, or if they feel as though it's politically opportunistic and ambitious, that they can do so. But thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you to please join me in thanking our panelists for 3 wonderful presentations. And now from food for thought to thought for food.
So we're breaking with the...
tea. There's one more session. It's tea, is it?
No, thank you, Chairperson and the panelists. We are already past the tea time, so what I would suggest that we start with the next session immediately. And those of you who want to have a cup of tea, it's ready. Have tea. But
I see. Okay.
Yes. So, but we are starting next session immediately. May I request Ambassador Bhatia to come on the dais and other panelists of the session?